Hi, I'm looking for assistance in finding housing.
You've come to the right place.
Oh, well, that's a relief. Not having a place to live is really stressful.
Don't worry. Here at the obstacle course of finding housing, we can help you find housing. Maybe?
What did you just call this?
The obstacle course of finding housing.
Yeah, what do you mean by that?
That you have to run the obstacle course first in order to find the housing.
Oh, I feel like I've already run into a lot of obstacles that have led me to here, asking you for help in finding housing.
Yep, and the obstacles don't stop there.
What do you mean? Are you going to put more obstacles in my way?
Oh, no, I'm not adding obstacles. I'm here to help you navigate the obstacles that are already there that are really obvious, and some really not so obvious nefarious ones.
This sounds hard.
It's not easy.
Aren't you in charge? Can't we just make it easy?
Believe me, we are trying. We are trying. But until then, we have to get you through all these obstacles like vouchers, landlords, discrimination, zoning, coded language, human bias, computer bias, covenants, and lack of housing. Just to name a few.
I guess I have no other choice. How do I get started running this obstacle course?
Well, the line to start the obstacle course is actually full right now, so you'll have to go on the wait list.
Okay, fine. Put me on the wait list then.
There is such a demand for housing assistance. The wait list is so long, so it's closed. But come back again in the future.
My name is Tane Danger. This is a housing podcast, and this is a series of conversations that we're having with folks about all the ins and outs of housing and affordable housing. And I'm very excited today because this is our first time having guests joining us through the power of Zoom from across the other side of the country. We have a group of folks who are joining us from Howard University and the Fair Housing Clinic there. And we are going to talk to them all about the work that they do, what is a fair housing clinic, and how we got to a place where this work is as important as it is. So an important thing just to set the table for everybody is to get a quick round of introductions from folks. Who are you, and how did you end up as part of this conversation today? All right, one of the directors, Professor Keesha Turner-Roberts. Do you want to say hello?
Hi, my name is Keesha Turner-Roberts. I am one of the clinical professors at Howard School of Law and the Fair Housing Clinic. I've been a longtime practitioner of housing, family law, as well as public benefits in the District of Columbia. I am so privileged and proud to be able to teach students and to mold and shape young minds to go out there and do some good.
And next to you is Professor Valerie Schneider.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Valerie Schneider. I've been with the Clinical Law Center at Howard University School of Law since 2012. And like my colleague, Keesha Turner-Roberts, I feel really privileged to work with such a powerful and sharp group of advocates, our student attorneys, and they really do the real work of the Clinical Law Center, representing clients in matters related to their housing across a bunch of different areas. I'm glad to be here.
Fabulous. Veronica, do you want to say hello?
Hi, I'm Veronica Craig, and I was a student in the Fair Housing Clinic this past year. I was interested in fair housing because I care about people who have been disadvantaged, and the clinic specifically works to help those groups of people in the DC area.
That's very cool. And then Chidiuto Cobb is one of the students as well who's joining us here today.
Hi, I'm Chidiuto Cobb. I'm a former student of the Fair Housing Clinic at Howard Law. The reason that I wanted to be in the housing clinic is that just so many parts of my own personal experience intersected in housing. And so I'm an immigrant, I'm a woman of color, and I come from a low-income background. And all those factors were driving factors in me wanting to be part of the Fair Housing Clinic, and just the hands-on experience that we're actually able to get by working with clients one-on-one was why I wanted to be in the clinic.
Awesome. And last and certainly not least, Jordan Strudwick is joining us from what looks like a lovely porch.
Strudwick. Yeah,
Strudwick,
it is a
excuse
lovely
me,
porch.
Strudwick.
It's okay. I was interested in fair housing and the Fair Housing Clinic because when I came into law school, I wanted to do human rights work. And since housing is one of the basic human needs, it seemed like a good opportunity.
Perfect. So, okay, we've always had a housing policy to some degree, but it seems like it's sort of within the 20th century that we kind of started to figure out like how cities wanted to plan themselves, how we sort of wanted to decide where people would be able to build and to live. And it seems like exactly at that same time, we also started to figure out, or we already knew, we figured out how to use that to disenfranchise, discriminate against groups of people. How did that discrimination show up? Probably in like very overt ways that created an uneven playing field for how people could build or where they could live.
Sure, I'll start us off, and I'm sure Professor Turner-Roberts can jump in, and the students as well. But I think one of the key things that's important to know is I think a lot of people see housing discrimination or segregation or gentrification or displacement as products of personal choice, that the driving forces behind those phenomena are personal choice. People want to live with certain groups of people or don't want to live with certain groups of people. And I think that view, while that may be part of the puzzle, it really neglects the core problem, which was and is racist policies that resulted in some of those things, some of those sort of personal choice phenomena. So from things like zoning rules that classified white neighborhoods as residential, for example, and Black neighborhoods in urban areas as industrial. And so that was a municipal sanctioned policy that created segregation, created facts on the ground. There were also federal subsidies for suburban development that were conditioned essentially on Black exclusion. And that's one of the ways that the middle class developed in America, was through the expansion of the suburbs. And African Americans were in many cases explicitly prohibited from taking advantage of one of the things that drove the growth of the middle class and drove a huge wealth gap. And in up through the mid part of the 19th century or 1900s, the Federal Housing Administration had explicitly racist guidelines and rules, so only financed the construction of segregated subdivisions by making its requirements apply only to the suburbs, so setback and lot size rules that accomplish some of those things. Taking the racial makeup of areas into consideration in determining what loans to underwrite and things like that, so explicitly exclusionary policies. Up until I think it was 1947, the Federal Housing Administration manual is explicitly racist. So it warned against underwriting where there was inharmonious racial groups. And it required, in some cases, restrictive covenants in order to underwrite loans. And I think after 1947, it sanitized the language, but still sort of had the same effect.
And we should say those covenants, and this is a big thing here, there's been a lot of work on this here in Minnesota, were things that said like, I am writing into the deed of my house, it can only be sold to a white person, or probably sometimes like a white Christian person or things like that.
That's true. And although those are unenforceable now, they're still in deeds. If you do a title search of my home, it prohibits the sale to African Americans, I believe Jews as well. And if you do a title search, you'll still find those on title. It can be easy to think about housing segregation as developing through personal choice, but I think it's really important to recognize the government forces that created segregation.
Professor Turner-Roberts, but then in the 60s, we got the Fair Housing Act, and that fixed everything, right?
Well, no, it didn't fix everything. It did make some of the restrictive covenants and the restrictive zoning policies illegal. But unfortunately, what the act was unable to fix is all the other treatment beforehand, and this is continued on, if that makes sense. The communities of color inability to generate wealth and so they can invest into their own neighborhoods. Like that continued, unfortunately, even though the discriminatory laws have changed. And so in essence, what you're having even up today is that, 80% of people of color are likely to be evicted. More than half will be families. And so you have still people of color are still behind that curve. Housing is just one piece of the puzzle. There's housing, there's health, there have ramifications with regards to housing, there's your level of education, the quality of school education that one has to think about as well. Because the more people who buy them homes, they usually invest in their communities, which there'll be more dollars to go towards schools. And so I think sometimes when people think about housing as its own silo, it has so many other tentacles that really touch a lot of other things. And unfortunately, that Civil Rights Act 1968, it remedied some of the issues, but still the cause is still there.
And this is a really important point. I think that this is a piece a lot of folks don't maybe immediately recognize, but very much like lives with us. So, Valerie Schneider, you were mentioning how at the time that we were coming up with these overt racist policies, there are also, I don't know if you want to call it more clever or subtle things, like you were talking about lot sizes or setbacks or different zoning rules that the people who were creating them at the time knew very well that they were doing this to keep certain people from ever being able to buy homes in this area or be able to live here. And while maybe the people who live in those suburbs or communities now don't have those same racist views explicitly, they still live in a place that has a lot of those rules still built in, right? Like they still have those setbacks and those minimum lot sizes and things like that. So it's like stuff that is like very much alive and part of where we are now, if I'm got this all right, I think.
I think that's right. We've created a structure that continues past the prohibition of explicit discrimination. And so I think you're right that a lot of the structural things that we talked about a few minutes ago, the impacts or the tentacles, as Professor Turner-Roberts said, reach into our current day. And without real concerted effort, the efforts that some of the students are making, we can't reverse the tide without sort of a focus on it.
So maybe this is a great opportunity for, if one of the students or a couple of the students want to, can you just give our listeners like a sense of the Fair Housing Clinic, what it is, the kind of work that you do for somebody who's never heard of you all before?
The Fair Housing Clinic provides free legal representation to tenants in DC who are in the DC Housing Court, the DC Landlord Tenant Court, or the DC Housing Conditions Courts, and just tries to make sure that they get, the type of representation that people deserve to have when they're in court. A lot of the people who we serve, other than free legal services, they don't have any type of avenue to get legal representation. And a unique thing about housing court, at least in DC, is that you're not guaranteed the right of counsel. So one thing that we see when we go observe in court often is that you have people who are tenants who are in there trying to get some very obvious issue, very obviously it's an issue solved, but because they're hearing words going past them that they don't understand and they don't have anybody to represent them to help, make it make sense to them. People are making decisions that are impacting the course of their life fundamentally, but they have no right to have the tools to understand what's happening. You see a lot of terrible things happen. Housing discrimination extends past just the process of acquiring housing and staying in your housing. It extends into the courtroom as well. And we also see things like judges who so plainly treat people who present one way very, very differently from people who present another way. When there are the few white tenants in the courtroom, they very plainly get treated differently than most Black tenants in the courtroom. That's the kind of thing that we try to, step in front of in order to help make sure that DC is a little bit more fair.
Veronica, Chidiuto, what's an example of like a case or the kinds of things that somebody ends up in housing court about? Knowing, of course, you can't probably share specific like case details of people that you're serving, but just for somebody who's maybe never even heard that there is a special housing court, like what do you go there for?
We mostly represent clients who have housing conditions cases, which means that they have repairs or things that need to be done in their apartment. And lots of times our clients have asked landlords or property managers to make repairs and they've ignored them repeatedly, or they've tried to get them to pay for the repairs. And then also we do eviction defense cases and some discrimination cases as well.
So that's perfect. So, Chidiuto, we're talking here about discrimination and how that shows up overtly and a lot of times covertly. And I'm just curious if you are willing to share or talk about how you see that playing out either in the courtroom. You know, Jordan talked about there are judges that this obviously is a challenge or a problem for them. But I imagine that you see it play out in a whole variety of different ways that may not even be noticeable at first blush to some folks, but is clearly based on some form of discrimination or bias or ignorance.
Yeah, so I think with today's form of discrimination, it looks a lot more like proxies. Like, so basically, I'm not going to say that, you know, Black people can't live here, but I can say people under a certain income, you can't say the certain number of kids, but let's say we only have 1-bedroom apartments available and you can't have this many people in the house. So while, yes, Black people are legally technically allowed to be there, they're just different things in the way, different I guess, substitutes for just saying Black that landlords or even just the system in general has found to keep Black people out of certain spaces. And I would say also in terms of with the courtroom, let's say you're a FedEx worker or something, and you have a housing case. So you show up in court and let's say just like your uniform, that by itself can paint a different picture than somebody that maybe can take time off work and come to court in a suit and tie. And that can actually change outcomes a lot. And that's some of the stuff that we saw in housing court. Our job as members of the clinic is to block out all those barriers and really get the court and even opposing counsel to really see the problem for what it actually is, as against giving other subconscious excuses for why this person doesn't deserve adequate housing. It's just like little things like that. And there obviously are more overt things, like not, like if somebody has a disability, not making adequate accommodations for their disability. That's also a discriminatory practice that we came across a couple of times. And it would usually be to people of color or people that are lower income that were receiving this kind of treatment or not receiving adequate treatment.
So when can someone challenge something legally, right? Like in the sense of this gets to be discriminating enough that I can make a case that this was purposeful for trying to keep a certain group of people out. I mean, we've kind of talked about, like, obviously all kinds of places have rules that say, oh, you know, you can only have, you know, one family living here. And those, you know, are prolific enough that it seems like that must be legal. But then you're talking about like, oh, if I were to say, well, I refuse to put in a wheelchair ramp, that would be illegal. So I'm curious if there's a sense of like, where's the line? Like at what point you can say like, you've obviously crossed into like discrimination territory here, or is that sort of just the art of what you all do every day?
I think it's a little bit of both. It is the art of what lawyers do. They advocate on behalf of their clients. The jurisprudence under the Fair Housing Act has declared that the Fair Housing Act should be construed very broadly, in particular the standing provisions under the Fair Housing Act. So generally, in order to sue under any law, you have to show that you have an injury. And that provision of who has an injury, who has standing to sue under the Fair Housing Act has been interpreted very broadly by courts. If you think you've suffered discrimination, if you feel that there's a barrier to you receiving fair treatment, then you may have a claim under the Fair Housing Act. We define in our clinic housing discrimination very broadly. And so we see gentrification as a form of discrimination, constructive eviction as a form of discrimination. So those are not, many of the cases we bring are not, we don't bring them under the Fair Housing Act, which is what people think of as the sort of non-discrimination law related to housing. But we've got, as the students have pointed out, we have tenants who are in buildings or in neighborhoods that are slated for redevelopment. And the landlords are letting the condition of the buildings degrade in hopes that people will leave. And we see that type of displacement as a form of discrimination. And so even though those aren't cases that we bring under the Federal Fair Housing Act or under our local equivalent, the DC Human Rights Act, it's still something that's within the purview of our mission as a fair housing clinic, because we really try to take as broad a view as possible as to what are the barriers between the clients we serve and our vision of housing justice. And any place that we can help address those things, we try to do that. And now my dog is making noise in the background.
I love it. This is the joy of Zoom life, is that we get to meet people's kids, their dogs. My cat might walk in here at any minute. Okay, imagine somebody's listening to this and they're really motivated and they want to go look at like their city codes or their city laws, their municipalities, to see if it's got things in it that are barriers for people or makes it harder to find that kind of housing justice that we're talking about. What are the things people should be looking for to see like if their system is set up in a way that's not fair or is discriminatory?
I'll just bounce in with a few things. There are a lot of facially neutral rules that have a discriminatory effect on communities of color or communities that are protected by the Fair Housing Act. So a good example of one of those is criminal background checks. So as has been widely reported at this point, there are racial differences around policing. And so, if communities of color are being policed in ways that are so different and so detrimental, so different from white communities and so detrimental, then when people go look for housing, if we're doing a background check and the background check is picking up arrests, plea deals, things that don't necessarily relate at all to whether or not you'd be a good tenant, and they may not relate at all to guilt or innocence. And they definitely have a disparate impact on communities of color. And so so one thing to look for is like some municipalities, including DC, have laws and regulations related to when housing providers, under what circumstances can they look at your criminal background, your criminal record, how far back can they look, what like mitigating factors might they have to take into account when making those decisions. So that's sort of something that I think is a real barrier. And then the other thing I think that I'm personally interested in, so right now many housing providers outsource to these big data companies housing decisions. So they say to a data company, give me a score. I've got 30 people applying for units here, and I want you to score them, and I'm going to choose the person to be a tenant who has the highest score. And those big data companies are relatively unregulated. The way that the algorithms are set up often have, algorithms take current data to make predictions. So if the current data is infected with racism, as we all know it is, then the predictions that the algorithms are making about potential tenants are also going to be infected with that same racism. So I think there are some areas that are kind of maybe of interest to some of your listeners that are, I think that some of the, there can be sort of virtual redlining if we're using data in ways where we're not conscious of the racial implications of its use.
Wow.
Yeah, another thing we need to think about is source of income discrimination. Say, for instance, if you're very low income, some landlords can hold that against you. They can decide whether or not, even if you meet the bare minimum amount to be able to make a rental payment, they can decide for whatever reason not to rent to you. That happens frequently in DC, usually it's with people who have what called vouchers. Vouchers basically they give it as like a golden ticket. It's a way that tenants can get housing in DC, affordable housing in DC, and it is illegal in DC to discriminate because someone has a housing voucher. You can't discriminate about the source of how they can pay their rent, as long as they can pay the rent. And so that has major implications. A majority of people of color, they do receive these vouchers in order for them to be able to live in housing. And so if you're really discriminating against them and their source of income, then you're preventing them from actually getting housing. And that's emblematic. I know DC, we do have a law against that, but other jurisdictions do not.
But Chidiuto, you unmuted yourself a minute ago. Were you going to jump in?
I was actually going to mention the vouchers. So basically, one thing I wanted to add was it's easy to lose your voucher and it's almost impossible to get another one. Like, I guess in DC, if you aren't using your voucher or if you haven't found a place to live, and I think it's in 6 months, you lose your voucher, but the wait list is like closed.
Yeah.
And so people that are in terrible living conditions might choose to stay where they are just so that they don't lose their voucher, so that they're not homeless at the end. Because it's so hard to find somewhere that will take vouchers, especially with even private individual people that are just renting out their condos or something. They often say no vouchers allowed. And they kind of go under the radar because they're not these big corporations that are regulated, but they're just these individual homeowners that are just choosing not to accept vouchers. So people with vouchers have that, I guess, housing insecurity because they know that the place that they're staying has bad conditions. They want to go somewhere else, but if they leave where they are and can't find a place, they lose their housing in general. So a lot of people end up choosing to stay at the worst place so that they can have somewhere to stay.
So we've done a very good job of painting a very realistic and bleak picture of like a lot of the things that are happening right now. I'm curious, like, so you all like are working on the ground, like, you know, you're in the courtroom trying to push back against things sort of in real time. What are the things to push toward so that we don't end up in these kinds of situations as often in the future? I'm curious, like, what other things you all think about that starts to dismantle some of these systems that have been around for so long and make a more equitable, even playing field in terms of housing?
I think that part of the change needs to be a change of attitude, a change of vocabulary. You know, who exactly are these individuals who are in dire straits, who have housing instability, right? Because I think it could be anyone. COVID-19 has proven to anyone can, in any situation, can end up with, you know, unstable housing. So I think part of it is just changing the vocabulary, changing how people feel about this issue. Right. It's just not like people who are lazy, who don't do what they're supposed to do, who, you know, but it could be anyone. And so, and we think at Howard anyway, that housing is a universal right. And so for everybody to think that way, it's just an attitude change needs to happen.
This seems like I have to ask you about this, which is in several of the conversations that we've had on this, people have brought this up that, you know, once upon a time, federal government more directly spent money on housing. Like it just built houses and built apartment buildings and things like that. I'm curious if you all think about, like, should the government, like, would you say, yeah, the government should just get back in the business of building stuff and like paying for people to have places to live directly?
That's kind of how like we got the middle class of white people that we have now, pretty much, like the suburbs and all of that was designed by government policy. There's a reason that the suburbs across the country all look pretty much the same. And so does the hood across the country, looks pretty much the same, because these were designed by federal policy. And people were talking about it earlier, how that federal policy of building up the suburbs and giving white folks the opportunity to acquire those assets, those homes, is what literally gave birth to and defined the middle class in the United States, and Black people were kept from that completely.
I mean, I think honestly, the overarching theme is legislation, and who's making decisions, who's in the room when decisions are being made. So while yes, we should be able to trust that the government will do these things that are equitable for all people and that are actually helpful, because there's so much politics involved in, zoning and even just whether this is going to be, like a suburb or a industrial place. There's just so much politics involved, and people's individual biases and self-interest plays into that. I think that's where we see a lot of the issues coming in. So I think a big thing would be for people to actually pay attention to what legislation is out there and what things can be construed in different ways.
Well, I also wanted to add to that just to say that in being aware of what's happening, like also being aware of the specific communities that it affects. Like if the government is going to fund housing or schooling, do it specifically in neighborhoods to create change for the people who you disenfranchised. The racial injustice that has already been happening in our country, but has just been shed light on. There's no more perfect time than now to start paying attention and coming up with legislation that is specific to communities of color and to communities that are low income.
To answer your question about sort of what are sort of the big changes that we can make that will really affect housing discrimination. And I think there's two ways to think of it. One is within the framework of the Fair Housing Act. So within the framework of the Fair Housing Act, which is honestly a bit under attack from HUD, the agency charged with enforcing the Fair Housing Act, how can we make the Fair Housing Act itself more robust, protective, and sort of really focused, laser focused on the problems that really exist on the ground? And then also thinking about outside of the Fair Housing Act, how can we think about, budgets, policy, both local, hyper local policies about where highways are going, where schools are going, all of those kinds of things, to all the way down the line thinking about reparations. And there are there's a lot of conversation going around about like the policy prescriptions that might change some of the circumstances our clients are finding themselves in.
Okay, well, one other giant can of worms maybe I'll open up. And it goes to some of this sort of how to rectify the segregation history that we have and the redlining history. There are prominent scholars who say the answer to that is to basically highly integrate places, to basically give historically underserved disenfranchised communities, pay them to go move into predominantly white suburbs or build things that are for those communities, so that we end up with a much more integrated housing situation all over the place. You hear other very smart thoughtful people say, no, that's just another form of discrimination, because now we've had 50, 60, maybe 100 years of building up a, maybe Black or Latino community in this place. And I don't want to go live in some white suburbs. That's not what I signed up for. And you're destroying my community by trying to get me to do that. I'm curious if you all think about that debate, and if you have sort of, I don't know, how we should think about it.
I think this is something that, we all might fall on different sides of the spectrum, but I think for me, the biggest thing would be taking away barriers for people to make their own decision of where to live. Have policies that promote an individual person being able to make that choice. And remove the barriers to whatever it would be that would prevent someone from making the choice of their own where to live. And to me, that is the crux of the issue. It's not necessarily that we should be completely mixed in and blended, and it's not necessarily that we should only prioritize certain communities. And I don't think that policy should really determine where that person lives, other than the fact that they should have a choice of where they live.
I think that it's sort of a hearts and minds issue. Like, do people want to do this? Is this what people would do of their own volition were it not for all those federal government policies? And like, we'll never know whether, if it wasn't for those federal government policies, we would live in an integrated society now or not, because it happened the way it happened. If somebody thinks that it is of value to create strong mixed neighborhoods, there would have to be some types of incentives, because like Newton's first law of motion, a body that's at rest is not going to move unless it's acted on by an external force. And the forces that created those segregated communities were really, really strong. Again, created by the federal government in order to separate people. So like, having had that much force applied to pull the people apart, it would probably take some incentives to draw those people together, assuming that that's a worthy goal, which people debate. I think for people to have choice, the choices have to exist in a robust way.
And to go to that last point, that's what I was thinking about. To me, I think before you can start providing incentives to move to different neighborhoods, all the neighborhoods need to look the same structurally and have the same access to things. And so, it's no secret that many communities across the country that are filled with Black people and Latino people are the poorer looking communities. No access to, or very limited access to, grocery stores. The schools look different. And so what is the incentive? I think the focus should be making the communities more equal and the same before trying to offer incentives to mix the communities in. Giving an incentive to move to a neighborhood that is predominantly white, for example, is not just mixing in because of race, but it's also going to give other opportunities for schooling, for, like I said, grocery, or just different things that are in the neighborhood. And so in order to isolate even the choice of wanting to live in a neighborhood that is racially mixed, it would need to be that all the neighborhoods are at least offered the same kinds of benefits, which really aren't benefits, groceries and schools. They should be basic human rights, but.
Yeah, that was brilliant. Thank you all three of you for that answer to that that complicated question. But before we go, I do want to just ask, is there anything you want to really make sure that people can walk away with and make sure that they're still thinking about when this is over?
This is Jordan. I probably said this 10 times already, but federal government policy is what designed all of these communities all across the country. That's why they all are almost cookie cutter in a lot of the fundamentals of the communities, because as much as state policy and city policy was involved, so much of this was by federal design. And then I think that if somebody really cares about this stuff, they should read Evicted, they should read The Color of Law, and they should read The Color of Money. And I think that if you read those three books, you'll have a pretty great understanding of these systems and how they came into place and how they perpetuate today.
This is Chidiuto. A good way to kind of see it in real life is to just drive around town. Think about the places that you don't want to be, or the places that you're afraid to be outside. A lot of times we don't really think broadly about, systems and all of that, but it's very practical to just drive to wherever you're going and just look to see what is available in the quote unquote bad neighborhood, or the neighborhood that seems undesirable, and what is available closer or around the more affluent neighborhoods. Like, would you consider those things essentials? And if you do, then you be able to, I guess, think more creatively on how to help people get access to be able to make housing choices and actually have their choices be choices that are really existent.
This is Veronica. One thing for me is a little bit more specific, is that in DC, the housing court was created for the tenants, so that the tenants could actually bring claims against the landlords, which, is great in the grand scheme of things, but I think the way that it operates now, from my opinion, is not maybe exactly how they originally set out for the court to be set up. And so we talk about lack of access and lack of understanding. There are so many people who, even though this court exists and it looks good on paper and it looks like it's helpful, a lot of people are not actually able to get what they need from the court because they don't understand words or documents or even the process of it. And so something that I would like is to, one, see progress in that court system, but also to see more courts set up like that throughout the country and not just like in a couple of cities. The legal system and so many systems are set up in a way that they make it so that there are groups of people that are not able to get an understanding. And it's like this knowledge is not something that they have access to. And so therefore they're disenfranchised and then they don't know how to help themselves. And so I think that's something that I would want people to be thinking about, especially people in positions of power who can create and change these things that are already in place.
This has been such a great conversation. I am just honestly, I'm very inspired by the work that you all do every day. And I really can't say how grateful I am that you all, like all of you, took this time to talk to us in Minnesota about it. It's very flattering and humbling, and I really appreciate it. So thank you for everything.
Thank you. Good luck with your podcast.
All right, thank you all. Have a great rest of your day. We'll talk to you all later. Thank you so much for listening to this installment of our podcast on housing and affordable housing. This episode was produced by Kelsey Dilts McGregor with help from Brandon Bode and me, Tane Danger. We'd like to thank our head scriptwriter, Heather Meyer, and actors Duck Washington and Erin Roberts. Our music is by Dan O. Funding was provided by Prosperity's Front Door. On behalf of everybody with the Theater of Public Policy, thank you so much, and we will see you next time.